Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, to take away the right from the poor. You know, this passage from the book of Isaiah really sets a solemn, deeply historical tone for what we're looking at today. Because throughout human history, we've constantly seen how laws and decrees can be crafted or interpreted in ways that disproportionately impact the most vulnerable people in society. It forces us to ask, what actually happens when a system of justice contains a foundational, written exception that literally allows for the suspension of fundamental human rights? Well, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a constitutional paradox that has basically been hiding in plain sight for over a century and a half. We're going to explore the 13th Amendment loophole and the deeply entrenched reality of prison labor in the United States. It's a topic that sits right at this massive intersection of history, economics, and human rights, and we are going to unpack exactly what the source material tells us about how it functions today.
Okay, let's dive into this. Didn't the 13th Amendment abolish slavery? I mean, the immediate, universal assumption for most of us is a resounding yes, right? We are taught that the 13th Amendment, ratified at the end of the Civil War in December of 1865, completely eradicated slavery and involuntary servitude in America. Full stop. Done. But as we look a little closer at the actual text of the Constitution, we find that this neat historical narrative comes with a highly consequential catch.
Here is the exact wording of the amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Did you catch that? Except as a punishment for crime. That phrase right there is what legal scholars refer to as the criminal exception loophole. Now, historically, this wasn't just some weird typo. Thomas Jefferson, who was actually inspired by the Italian criminologist Cesare Beccaria, really supported this idea of using forced labor as criminal recompense. Beccaria believed that instead of the death penalty, making an offender provide hard labor was a way for them to pay back their debt to society and their victims. But the application of this clause took a very, very different path. Section 1. History, from convict leasing to modern labor. To truly wrap our heads around how this constitutional loophole operates today, we kind of have to look backwards at how this exception clause was immediately weaponized right after the Civil War. So the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865. Almost overnight, many southern states, and honestly some northern ones too, enacted black codes. This included vagrancy laws, which basically criminalized just being unemployed. If you were convicted of vagrancy, you were sent to prison and then leased out to private companies or plantations as unpaid labor. It was functionally a system designed to re-enslave newly freed black men, and the profitability was absolutely staggering. By 1898, the state of Alabama was generating a whopping 73% of its entire state revenue strictly from convict leasing. This explicit practice of leasing convicts out continued for decades until President Franklin D. Roosevelt officially banned it on a federal level in 1941.
Which brings us to Section 2, the economics of prison labor.
Because here is the thing. While the explicit system of convict leasing ended, the actual use of incarcerated labor did not. It just transitioned into the modern era. The name changed, the mechanism shifted, but the system itself remains a massive, highly profitable enterprise woven right into the fabric of the American economy. Just think about the sheer scale of it today. Out of approximately 1.2 million incarcerated people in state and federal prisons, nearly 800,000 are prison laborers. That's roughly 2/3 of the entire prison population, and according to the ACLU, these workers produce over $2 billion in goods and more than $9 billion in services every single year. A lot of that is for the maintenance of the prisons themselves, sure, but it's also for government-run businesses and private sector employers. Yet despite generating literally billions of dollars in value, consider this staggering number. The average hourly wage for a prison laborer nationwide is between 13 cents and 52 cents an hour. Let that sink in. And it gets wilder. According to the Economic Policy Institute, in 7 southern states, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas, almost all the work performed by prisoners remains entirely unpaid, 0 cents. And hey, even for those who do earn those pennies per hour, they rarely see the full amount. States can and regularly do severely garnish these already meager wages. We are talking deductions of up to 80% of a worker's paycheck just to cover things like room and board, facility maintenance, gas for transportation to their jobs, and even laundry fees. The ripple effect of this is huge. Because incarcerated folks can't earn a meaningful wage to support themselves, the financial burden of basic needs, like a simple phone call home, commissary items, or basic hygiene products, shifts directly onto their families on the outside, who are often already economically strained. Let's move to Section 3, administrative enslavement.
Now, what's really interesting about this next concept is how it bridges the gap between that old constitutional text and the reality inside prison walls today. University of Chicago law professor Adam A. Davidson unpacked a truly fascinating legal reality. If you look at modern criminal sentencing hearings or appellate records, you will almost never find a judge actively sentencing someone to slavery or involuntary servitude. The courts just aren't doing it. Instead, Davidson found that forced labor continues as a function of administrative decision-making. Prison administrations are the ones mandating the labor. If an inmate refuses to work, they can face administrative punishments like solitary confinement. Davidson actually coined a term for this: administrative enslavement, forced labor that occurs without explicit judicial sentencing.
When we neutrally stack up standard labor rights against prison labor, the stark lack of legal protections is pretty glaring. In the regular labor market, workers are protected by occupational safety laws, they have legal recourse and compensation if they're injured on the job, and they're guaranteed a minimum fair wage. Prison laborers, however, are explicitly excluded from workplace safety and labor laws. If an incarcerated worker gets injured while performing their duties, they have virtually no legal recourse to file a complaint or seek compensation.
To put a human face to this data, let's look at the California Conservation Camp Program. In early 2025, over 1,000 incarcerated people were deployed to fight devastating wildfires in Los Angeles. They were working side by side with civilian firefighters in the exact same extreme danger and during the exact same 24-hour shifts. But while the civilian firefighters earned a full salary, the inmates earned between $5.80 and $10.24 for the entire day. Now, to be fair, it's absolutely vital to note that many incarcerated people report actually wanting to work. They gain valuable skills, they can earn time off their sentences, and they often find a profound sense of purpose in jobs like firefighting. So the debate we're seeing isn't necessarily about stopping work altogether, but rather about the conditions, the danger, and the lack of fair compensation and protection.
This brings us to Section 4, the reform movement. Because, as you might guess, this constitutional loophole is not going unchallenged. There are ongoing, high-stakes political and legal battles occurring state by state right now. Over the last few years, a massive wave of ballot measures has swept the country, asking voters if they want to remove the criminal exception clause from their state constitutions. Colorado led the way, repealing theirs in 2018. Since then, voters in Alabama, Nebraska, Nevada, Oregon, Tennessee, Utah, and Vermont have all voted to explicitly ban slavery and involuntary servitude without any exceptions. However, it is not a uniform trend. Voters in states like California and Louisiana recently rejected these ballot measures, keeping the exception totally intact. And in states like New Jersey, similar legislative efforts are currently stalled out. So the crucial takeaway here is that just changing the text of a state constitution doesn't automatically change the system on the ground. Take Alabama. Voters repealed the exception there in 2022. But a massive lawsuit, Council versus Ivey, was filed shortly after. The plaintiffs, including labor unions, alleged that the Alabama Department of Corrections was intentionally denying parole to eligible inmates just to keep a captive, cheap labor force. An Associated Press investigation then found the state generated $250 million by garnishing prisoner paychecks and charging them fees. On the other side of the aisle, the state strongly defended its practices, and a federal judge recently dismissed the lawsuit without prejudice, meaning the plaintiffs can totally refile if they bring new evidence. It is a highly complex, multi-million-dollar legal standoff, and it's far from over.
All of which leaves us with this final, truly provocative question. Up at the federal level, lawmakers have proposed the Abolition Amendment, which would literally strike the words "except as a punishment for crime" directly from the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. It would be a monumental legal shift, requiring a 2/3 vote in Congress and ratification by 38 states. So I leave you to reflect on this, considering the dark history of convict leasing, the economics of modern prison labor, and the fundamental questions of human dignity. Should the criminal exception loophole be closed once and for all? What do you think the future of American constitutional law and labor should actually look like? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.